Hey there, welcome. Today we're looking at the deadliest bad decisions ever made at the Grand Canyon, where you'll quickly realize that the canyon has absolutely no room for stupidity.
From a man who tried to ego-run the canyon to prove he was tough, to a first-time mule rider who leaned too far for a better view, ending his canyon experience in the craziest way possible. It was the 9th of June, 2017, at the Grand Canyon in Arizona. The weather was warm and hundreds of visitors had arrived early to explore the South Rim. Harvey Idris was 27 years old and lived in Denver, Colorado. He worked as an insurance adjuster and was an experienced marathon runner. Running was a major part of his life, and he took pride in his endurance and discipline. A few months earlier, Harvey had entered a marathon but finished behind another runner named Kyle. Afterward, Kyle often talked about his intense training routines, claiming he ran steep mountain trails, trained in extreme heat, and completed workouts in remote areas. Harvey never challenged those stories. Hearing them bothered him. He felt people admired Kyle not just for winning, but for being tougher than everyone else. And I think that's the part that really stuck with Harvey. Losing a race is one thing. Feeling like somebody is tougher than you is something else entirely.
In the weeks that followed, Harvey became focused on proving something to himself.
He wanted a challenge that would be harder than a marathon and more demanding than anything he had done before. That was when he started reading about the Grand Canyon. The South Rim route immediately caught his attention, and he convinced himself that the canyon would simply be a tougher version of a marathon he would be able to handle. His friend warned him that the canyon was completely different from a road race. The steep elevation changes, the heat, and the dry air could wear people down much faster than expected. The friend urged him to carry water, glucose packets, and emergency supplies. Harvey refused. He pointed out that he had completed long races before without hydration stops, and believed carrying extra supplies would only slow him down.
Now this is the part of the story where I started shaking my head like, oh god, a marathon has aid stations, but a canyon does not. Those are two very different environments.
On the morning of June 9th, Harvey arrived at the Grand Canyon alone. He parked near the South Rim and prepared to begin his run. He carried very little with him. He brought no water, no energy supplements, and no emergency equipment. He intended to finish the route and return to his car the same day. At first, everything seemed normal. Harvey settled into a steady pace and moved comfortably along the trail. The morning air felt manageable, and the run began much the way he expected. As the hours passed, conditions changed. The temperature climbed higher. The dry air pulled moisture from his body with every mile. The steep climbs demanded far more energy than he had anticipated. Unlike an organized marathon, there were no aid stations and no crowds cheering runners forward. Harvey continued running despite becoming increasingly dehydrated. Several miles down one of the South Rim trails, he noticed the heat becoming far more intense than it had been that morning. His throat felt dry and he realized he was sweating heavily, but he convinced himself the discomfort was temporary and kept moving. And this is the point where I wish someone had been there to tell him to stop. His pace slowed and simple sections of the trail became difficult. Eventually, he left the main trail and moved toward a small shaded area. He sat down intending to rest for a few minutes before continuing. Instead, his condition continued to deteriorate. Without water or any way to cool down, the heat and dehydration took a severe toll on his body. Alone and far from assistance, Harvey never made it back to the trail. His friend expected to hear from him that evening, but no message arrived. By the second day, concern turned into alarm, and park authorities were contacted. Rangers searched the canyon and eventually found Harvey dead near the shaded area where he had stopped to rest. Investigators determined that severe dehydration and heat-related illness had led to his death. Harvey believed endurance alone would carry him through the canyon. In the end, the canyon demanded something he never brought with him, which is water.
The next person I'm going to talk about has the opposite problem. He had all the safety equipment he needed and still decided that it was getting in his way.
It was the 22nd of May, 2020, at the Grand Canyon South Rim in Arizona. The weather was clear, and dozens of tourists had gathered for helicopter tours that offered aerial views of the canyon's cliffs, rock formations, and vast desert landscape. Esmond Cassander was 38 years old and lived in Las Vegas, Nevada. He worked as a marketing consultant and spent much of his free time traveling and creating content for social media. For the past 5 years, he had taken a vacation every May to visit a different location. This year, he had chosen the Grand Canyon. He wanted photographs that captured the sheer scale of the canyon and hoped to return home with images that looked more impressive than anything he had taken before.
That afternoon, Esmond booked an open-door helicopter photography tour.
Before takeoff, the crew gave a safety briefing and fitted each passenger with a harness attached to the aircraft. They repeatedly warned passengers not to loosen or tamper with the restraints during the flight. Esmond listened while preparing his camera equipment. "I always pay attention when a safety rule gets repeated multiple times. Usually that's because somebody has ignored it before, and what happens next proves that." About 20 minutes into the flight, the helicopter reached one of the most scenic sections of the canyon. Esmond began taking photographs through the open doorway. Although the harness restricted some of his movement, it was designed to prevent passengers from falling while leaning out for pictures. He had already taken dozens of photographs, but none matched the image he had imagined before the trip. As the helicopter passed over one of the canyon's deepest sections, he became frustrated that the harness prevented him from leaning out as far as he wanted. He wanted a shot that looked more dramatic than the ones he had already taken.
After a few moments of hesitation, Esmond convinced himself that the restriction was only getting in the way.
Despite repeated warnings, he tampered with part of his restraint system. He told himself he only needed a little more freedom to lean out and that nothing would go wrong. I think that's how a lot of dangerous decisions happen. People don't usually think they're taking a huge risk. They convince themselves they're only bending the rules a little. Then, a few minutes later, the helicopter banked gently while following the canyon's contours. The maneuver was routine and well within normal operating limits. As Esmond leaned outward to take another photograph, he lost his balance. Without the restraint properly securing him, he slipped from the aircraft and fell into the canyon below, and he didn't get up after that. The pilot immediately declared an emergency and returned to the nearest landing area, but there was nothing rescuers could do for Esmond. His body was recovered later that day. Investigators found no mechanical problems with the helicopter and determined that the accident occurred after Esmond tampered with his safety restraint during the flight. The medical examiner recorded his cause of death as multiple traumatic injuries sustained in the fall. Authorities found no evidence of pilot error or equipment failure, and no charges were filed. The camera recovered from the scene contained dozens of photographs he had already taken. The final photograph he leaned out to capture was never taken. Esmond ignored a safety system because he thought he knew better. But what comes next really baffles me. The next couple didn't ignore safety rules at all. They simply assumed a short walk would stay a short walk. It was the evening of 14th August 2019 at the Grand Canyon. The temperatures had cooled after a hot day, and many visitors were still gathered along the south rim, watching the sunset over the canyon. Ellington, 52, and Jacqueline, 49, were a married couple from Albuquerque, New Mexico, who enjoyed visiting national parks together. During their trip to the Grand Canyon, they spent the day sightseeing and taking photographs. As sunset approached, they decided to take one final walk before returning to their hotel. Despite warning signs recommending water, lights, and emergency supplies, Ellington insisted they would only be gone briefly and didn't need supplies. The couple set off carrying just a small bottle of water and a single mobile phone.
I've stood at trailhead signs like that one before, and I understand the impulse to think that it doesn't apply to you, but I think they had a different experience.
Shortly after sunset, they entered the trail. At first, everything seemed straightforward. The path was easy to follow, and the cooler temperatures made walking comfortable. As darkness gradually settled over the canyon, however, visibility became increasingly limited. The flashlight on their phone illuminated only a narrow section of trail ahead of them. About 40 minutes into the hike, they reached an area where the trail switched back along a rocky slope. Jacqueline suggested turning around before it became too dark to safely navigate. Ellington disagreed. He believed they still had plenty of time and convinced her to continue. A short while later, they missed a turn and unknowingly left the maintained trail. Neither of them immediately realized what had happened. The terrain ahead still appeared walkable, and they assumed they would reconnect with the trail farther along. Instead, they found themselves moving through unfamiliar ground while darkness continued to increase around them. When they eventually realized they were lost, they faced an important choice. They could remain where they were and wait until daylight, or they could continue trying to find their way back in the dark. She had already suggested turning back once. I think about Jacqueline in that moment knowing something was wrong and not being able to change what happened next. Ellington chose to keep moving. The decision would prove fatal.
As they crossed a steep rocky section, Ellington stepped onto loose ground near the edge of a slope.
His footing gave way beneath him. He lost his balance and tumbled down the rocky incline. Jacqueline watched helplessly as his body struck rocks during the fall. He came to rest far below, badly injured and unable to move. She immediately climbed down to reach him. When she arrived, it was obvious he was badly injured. He was conscious but unable to stand or climb. The fall had left him seriously hurt and stranded far below the trail. The couple attempted to call for help, but the canyon's terrain provided little or no phone reception, and I think this is where the reality of the situation finally hit them. With darkness surrounding them and no clear route back to the trail, Jacqueline remained with her husband throughout the night. The following morning, hotel staff reported the couple missing after they failed to check out. Rangers launched a search and eventually found them below the trail. Ellington Faraday had died from injuries sustained in the fall, while Jacqueline was rescued and survived. Investigators concluded the tragedy stemmed from a series of poor decisions, including entering the canyon late in the day with minimal supplies, relying on a phone for light, and continuing after becoming lost. What began as a simple walk became a fatal accident when one mistake left no room for recovery.
The next case I found is even weirder. It starts differently because he actually found exactly what he was looking for, but it came with a cost.
It was September 18th, 2021, at the Grand Canyon. The weather was clear and many visitors were hiking the trails and taking photographs of the scenery. Tobias Marcy Zahir was 34 years old and lived in Phoenix, Arizona. He worked as a web designer and enjoyed outdoor photography. During his visit to the Grand Canyon, he hoped to capture unique pictures of the landscape. Earlier that day, Tobias heard hikers talking about a mountain lion that had been spotted nearby. Excited by the possibility of seeing one in the wild, he became determined to find it and take a photograph. And I completely understand why that caught his attention. Seeing a mountain lion is rare. The chance to photograph one would feel like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. As he continued hiking, Tobias began paying more attention to the surrounding terrain than to the trail itself. Several times he stopped to scan the rocky slopes and patches of brush in hopes of spotting the animal. Hours passed without success. Frustrated but still determined, Tobias continued searching the area for signs of the animal. But the moment he decided that getting a photograph was more important than staying on the marked trail, he began taking risks he normally wouldn't have taken. The animal disappeared behind a ridge. Instead of remaining on the designated path, Tobias deliberately left the trail and started following the direction the mountain lion had traveled. Several warning signs in the area advised visitors not to leave marked routes because of unstable terrain and the danger of becoming lost. Tobias ignored those warnings. Convinced the photograph would be worth it, he continued deeper into unfamiliar ground.
I've noticed that people rarely decide to get lost. They make a series of small choices that slowly carry them farther and farther away from where they should be.
Eventually, Tobias spotted movement behind a cluster of boulders. A mountain lion suddenly emerged from behind the rocks only a short distance away. Both froze for several seconds before the animal turned and disappeared into the brush. Relieved, Tobias decided to leave. But as he turned around, he realized he had wandered much farther from the trail than he thought. The terrain around him was steep and unfamiliar. Trying to retrace his route, Tobias began crossing a rocky slope. Loose stones shifted beneath his feet. He lost his balance and stumbled. Tobias slipped and tumbled down the hillside, striking multiple rocks as he fell. His body rolled across the rough ground, hitting boulders and jagged edges. He fell over 50 feet before finally coming to a stop far below. The fall left him badly injured. Dazed and in severe pain, he attempted to stand but immediately collapsed. One of his legs appeared broken. Several of his belongings had been scattered during the fall. When he reached for his phone, he discovered the screen had shattered and the device would no longer function. Unable to call for help, Tobias remained where he had fallen. After searching several sections of the canyon, rescuers eventually located Tobias. He was still alive but had suffered severe injuries from the 50-foot fall. Despite rescue efforts, he later died from complications caused by those injuries. Investigators concluded that while the delay in reaching him likely worsened his condition, the fall itself was the primary cause of death. Tobias survived the animal he was searching for and was ultimately defeated by the terrain around it.
But the next man didn't go looking for danger at all. He walked directly up to it and grabbed it by the tail.
It was the afternoon of June 3rd, 2015 at the Grand Canyon in Arizona. The weather was clear and hikers were moving along the trails, enjoying the scenery. Calix Bramwell was 35 years old and visiting the Grand Canyon on vacation. He worked as an office manager in Denver, Colorado, and enjoyed the outdoors. Although he had little experience with wildlife, years of watching professional snake handlers on television had convinced him that handling venomous snakes was easier than it actually was. Friends also knew him as someone who rarely took injuries seriously and avoided doctors whenever possible.
And that's a combination I never like hearing about. Overconfidence is dangerous on its own.
Pair it with someone who hates asking for help, and small problems can become very big ones. During his hike that afternoon, Kalik spotted a western diamondback rattlesnake resting beside a large rock a few feet from the trail. The snake was not blocking the path. It was not coiled in a defensive position. It showed no interest in the hikers passing nearby, and every person who walked past simply gave it space and kept moving. Kalik stopped to watch it. When a few other hikers gathered nearby, he told them he had seen people pick snakes up by the tail on television and that it looked straightforward. One of the hikers told him to leave it alone. Kalik laughed and said it would be easy to control. I think television deserves some blame here. Just joking anyways. People spend years watching trained professionals perform dangerous tasks, but what they don't see are the years of experience behind those few minutes on screen. Before anyone could say anything else, he stepped off the trail and grabbed the snake by the tail. What happened next took only a few seconds. The rattlesnake twisted hard and fast in a way Kalik had not expected. On television, the snakes held by professionals remained relatively extended. This one folded back on itself almost immediately and struck his right hand between the thumb and index finger. The fangs went in deep. He released the snake and stumbled backward. It disappeared beneath the rocks. The two puncture wounds were small but clearly visible and already beginning to swell. Kalik looked at his hand and told the people around him it was probably a dry bite. He said he felt fine. Several hikers urged him to call for help immediately, but he refused and insisted he only needed water and shade. Over the next several hours, his condition steadily worsened. The swelling spread up his arm and the pain intensified. By evening, he was nauseous, dizzy, and struggling to concentrate. Despite repeated warnings from other hikers, he refused to call for help and insisted the symptoms would pass. What gets me is that multiple people were telling him the exact same thing. At some point, I have to wonder what it would have taken for him to realize they were right.
By the time he finally agreed to contact emergency services, nighttime was approaching. Because he was deep inside the canyon, rescuers needed hours to reach and evacuate him.
Doctors later administered antivenom, but the venom had already been affecting his body for much of the day. The delay in treatment allowed severe complications to develop, placing his organs under extreme stress. Kalik Bramwell died the following day from complications related to the envenomation. The medical examiner recorded his cause of death as systemic envenomation from a rattlesnake bite, complicated by a critical delay in treatment. Investigators later noted that the snake had been resting peacefully and posed no threat to anyone on the trail. It had not chased him, it had not followed him, it had simply defended itself the moment he grabbed it. Meanwhile, I almost skipped Zinnia's case, because the danger was obvious from the very beginning. In pursuit of likes and views, she ultimately paid with her life. It was the morning of September 16th, 2014, at the Grand Canyon in Arizona. Visitors stood along the overlooks, taking photographs and admiring the dramatic cliffs that dropped sharply into the canyon below. Zinnia Finnegan was 29 years old and lived in Phoenix, Arizona. She worked as a sales assistant and loved spending her free time outdoors. Whenever she traveled, she took photographs and recorded videos to share online with friends and family.
Over time, she became interested in creating content that looked different from the thousands of travel videos posted every day.
She enjoyed finding unusual locations and ideas that would make her videos stand out from everyone else doing the same thing. Let me be sincere here. If you've ever posted photos or videos online, you've probably felt the temptation to do something a little different from everyone else. The problem is that different and safe don't always go together. During a trip to the Grand Canyon with several friends, Zinnia spent the morning exploring viewpoints and taking photographs. While walking along the south rim, she noticed a narrow rock formation sitting beyond the main viewing area. From a distance, the formation appeared to extend out over the canyon, and people standing on it looked completely exposed, with open air on both sides and nothing stable beneath them for a significant drop below. Zinnia immediately liked the idea. She thought the formation would make an impressive video. Her friends were less enthusiastic. They pointed out that the rock looked uneven and completely exposed, and reminded her that visitors were expected to stay inside the designated viewing areas. One of them said plainly that a single wrong step near that edge would leave no room for recovery, Zinnia believed they were worrying too much and said she would only be out there for a few moments.
Whenever I hear multiple people warning someone about the exact same thing, I pay attention. It's easy to dismiss one concerned person, it's harder to dismiss several.
Then she made it more complicated. Earlier that morning, she had bought a small woven basket from one of the gift shops near the entrance. Standing there looking at the formation, she decided the video would be more interesting if she balanced the basket on her head while crossing the rock. Her friends went quiet for a moment before pushing back harder than before. They told her to forget the whole thing and come back to the viewing area. Zinnia laughed and told them she had good balance and had walked uneven trails plenty of times before. She left the designated area and climbed onto the formation while one of her friends recorded on a phone. And once the camera started rolling, I think the chances of her backing out dropped dramatically. For the first several seconds, everything looked fine. Zinnia moved carefully across the rock with the basket sitting on top of her head, smiling toward the camera as she went. The surface narrowed. The further out she walked and the ground dropped away sharply below the canyon, runs roughly a mile deep in places, and the terrain beneath her consisted of cliffs and rock shelves with no flat ground anywhere, near the base of the formation. Her attention was split 3 ways at once between where she was placing her feet, keeping the basket level, and staying aware of where the camera was.
As she approached the outer section of the formation, she made a small sideways adjustment to stop the basket from sliding.
Her foot came down slightly wrong on the uneven rock surface. She suddenly lost her balance and tried to recover, but there was nowhere safe to step. She stumbled once near the edge and disappeared from sight. Emergency services were called by witnesses, and rangers quickly responded. The area was secured, but due to the height of the fall, there was nothing rescuers could do. Zinnia Finnegan was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators found no equipment failure or weather-related factors. The accident was attributed to a series of decisions that morning. Leaving the designated viewing area, stepping onto an exposed rock formation above a sheer drop, balancing an object on her head, and ignoring repeated warnings from her friends. Meanwhile, Zeph only wanted one more look at a place that meant something to him. What happened next turned an ordinary guided ride into a tragedy no one on that trail would forget. It was the morning of June 11th, 2018 at the Grand Canyon in Arizona. The sun had already begun warming the rocky landscape as hikers and runners set out along the trails. Zeph Marcus Quillan was 63 years old and lived in Colorado Springs, Colorado. He had spent most of his career working as a building contractor before retiring. Friends described him as hardworking and dependable, someone who rarely sat still for long. 3 years before the trip, his wife had died after a long battle with cancer. Before her health had deteriorated too much to travel, the couple had taken one final trip together to the Grand Canyon, a place she had always loved. He watched her sit for hours looking out across the canyon without ever growing tired of the view. After her death, Zeph stayed close to home for a long time and rarely traveled.
As the years passed, he slowly began revisiting the places that had meant the most to both of them.
In the spring of 2018, he decided to return to the Grand Canyon to see the view again and remember the trip they had shared. During the visit, he booked several activities, including a guided mule ride that would take him deeper into the canyon. On the morning of June 11th, Zeph arrived at the stables and joined the tour group. Guides reviewed the safety rules before the group set off. Riders were told to remain seated properly, avoid sudden movements, and stay centered in the saddle throughout the entire ride. The group moved out along the trail, and for much of the ride, Zeph appeared relaxed. He spent much of the ride looking out toward the canyon rather than paying attention to the trail ahead. I can understand why. The views in places like this can be overwhelming. Sometimes people become so focused on what's beside them that they stop thinking about what's directly underneath them. The trail eventually reached a narrower section with steep drops beside the path. Guides reminded everyone again to remain centered. The group continued forward through a series of rocky switchbacks. At some point along that section, Zeph leaned away from the center of the saddle.
Despite the repeated safety instructions, he shifted his weight outward to get a better view of the canyon below.
His weight had shifted noticeably outward before anything happened. When his mule stepped across uneven ground moments later, the movement combined with his shifted position to catch him completely off balance. Because he was already leaning away from the center of the saddle, he had little chance to recover his balance once the mule moved beneath him. He had no time to correct himself. He slipped from the saddle and fell from the trail down the steep, rocky slope below. And that's what makes this so unsettling to me. The mistake happened before the fall. The fall was just the consequence catching up to it. The slope dropped sharply from the trail edge, and the terrain below was loose rock and uneven ground, with nothing to stop a person from continuing to fall once they left the path. Other riders immediately shouted for help and alerted the guides. Emergency personnel were contacted straight away, and rescue efforts began as quickly as possible. I always feel for the people left standing on the trail in situations like this. One moment they're enjoying the view, and the next they're watching a rescue unfold below them. The location made it difficult. The slope below the trail was steep and hard to access, and rescue teams had to work carefully to reach the area, while guides managed the remaining riders on the narrow path above. Despite those efforts, Zeph died from injuries suffered in the fall. The medical examiner recorded the cause of death as fatal traumatic injuries consistent with a fall from a canyon trail onto rocky terrain below. Investigators reviewed witness statements and guide reports. The accident occurred after he moved away from the centered riding position that guides had repeatedly instructed riders to maintain. What began as an ordinary mule ride through one of America's most famous landscapes ended in a tragic accident that claimed his life.